Alright. Do you have any history of a sprained ankle?
No.
Okay. So, tell me if this hurts. Does this hurt?
No.
Does this hurt?
No.
Does this hurt?
Yes.
Okay. We're gonna have to get you to the health office.
Okay.
Alright.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, bro. Okay. He's hurt. Jack it up.
Matt's over.
Yeah.
Oh, Matt's over. Look at my knee.
What's that?
You look at my knee?
Sure. What's going on?
I don't know. It got worse.
Well, okay.
Where's the tape?
What a beaut. What a beaut.
What is rice?
I have no idea.
What does RICE stand for?
Rice is rest, ice, something and elevate.
Yes.
C is
Compress.
compact. Is it
Compress.
Compress.
Right? Yeah. Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What does RICE stand for?
Rest, ice, compression, elevate.
Got a sprained ankle.
And what did you do?
I iced, compressed it, elevated it.
You ever sprained your ankle?
Yes,
What did you do to heal it?
the rice technique.
Which is?
Rest, ice, compress, elevate.
Do to help your sprained ankle.
Rest, ice, compress, and elevate.
Thank you. Mr. Rod, do you know what the RICE acronym is?
Ready?
Yep.
Yeah. Rest, ice, compression, and elevation. What else do you want?
That's it. Have you ever sprained your ankle before?
All the time.
How many times?
More than 20?
Wow.
I'm old.